Hey guys, tonight we stare at a tomato. A perfectly round, ruby-red tomato sitting innocently on the edge of a Victorian sideboard, gleaming in the afternoon light like it belongs in a still life painting, or possibly a cautionary tale. It sits there, not sliced, not sauced, not tucked between bread and bacon, but whole, watching, waiting. And you probably won't survive this. Not because the tomato is actually dangerous, but because your 19th century sensibilities are going to spiral dramatically into culinary suspicion, mild social panic, and a vague correspondence with your apothecary. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and the current time in the comments. I like to know who else is awake while worrying about Victorian vegetables. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of the drawing room, saucer in one hand, monocle possibly in the other, eyeing the tomato like it might leap into your tea. You've heard things. You've read things. The tomato is new, foreign, southern in the geographic sense and the suspicious one. You lean closer. It smells vegetal, which is not helpful. It might be fruit. It might be poison. It might be both. A mainstream historical fact. In the 1700s and early 1800s, tomatoes were often viewed with suspicion in England and parts of Europe. Their association with the nightshade family, which includes deadly plants like belladonna and mandrake, made people wary, particularly among the upper class who were less inclined to experiment with their own dinner. You reach for your fork, pause, set it down again, because there was that story about Lord Exeter's cousin. Or maybe it was a baronet in Devonshire. He ate a tomato, died within hours, or days. Or possibly he just went pale and had to lie down. But still, someone wrote a pamphlet. Here's your quirky tidbit. One popular theory at the time was that the acidity of tomatoes reacted with pewter plates or silverware, leaching lead into the food. The result wasn't tomato poisoning, but heavy metal toxicity. Naturally, the tomato got blamed anyway. You gently push the tomato further from the edge of the table, just in case it falls and explodes into noxious gas, or stains the rug. You glance at the newspaper folded by the chair. A headline reads, "New World Fruit or Devil's Pudding?" You do not open it. Instead, you retreat to the garden, where cucumbers still feel trustworthy, and rhubarb remains safely ornamental. You make a mental note. Ask the gardener if any of the tomato vines have started whispering. Not urgently, just when convenient. The breeze rustles the hedges. You breathe and decide firmly that today is not the day to risk your reputation or your cutlery on a round, red, maybe vegetable with ideas. You retreat from the drawing room like someone avoiding eye contact with a tiger in a bonnet. The tomato remains on the sideboard, radiant and impassive. You, however, go straight to the study. For research, you pull down your father's copy of Systema Naturae, which you've never read cover to cover but which looks excellent on a shelf and smells like botanical confusion. You flip through the pages until you find the entry for Solanum lycopersicum. You pause. Read it again. Lycopersicum. It sounds feral. You whisper it softly as though saying the name might trigger a transformation. The words translate loosely to wolf peach, which is not how you typically describe your salads. A mainstream historical fact. The Latin name for the tomato, Solanum lycopersicum, was partly derived from the idea that the fruit belonged to the nightshade family, Solanum, and had a dangerous, almost animal quality. The name wolf peach came from earlier beliefs that tomatoes were used to lure werewolves. Yes, really. You lean back in your chair. Your knees crack like dry wood. Possibly from fear. Possibly from age. You glance out the window at your neighbor's garden. She has tomato vines climbing her trellis. They seem taller than they were yesterday. You make a mental note to measure them later. You turn the page and read about solanine, an alkaloid found in some nightshades. It's mildly toxic, capable of causing digestive upset and existential dread. Not tomatoes necessarily, but close enough for the imagination to frolic. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some 18th and 19th century gardeners grew tomatoes solely for ornamental purposes, treating them like exotic flowers. They prized the bright fruit, admired the foliage, and avoided ingestion with a kind of polite terror. You make a cup of weak tea. Avoid the sugar. Stare into it like it might reveal the truth. In the corner of the room, your cat jumps onto the windowsill and begins grooming itself with a smugness that implies it knows tomatoes are harmless, but won't tell you. You return to the book. Read the same sentence again. The tomato is a member of the Solanaceae family. You underline member. Then, just to be sure, underline family. You don't like the idea of a fruit with relatives, especially not poisonous ones. You close the book, lock the cabinet, and wonder if cucumbers have ever been accused of witchcraft. Just in case. You sleep poorly that night, not because of indigestion. Your dinner was 2 boiled potatoes and a single buttered oatcake, but because you dreamt of vines creeping through the floorboards, red fruits hung from the rafters like lanterns, one rolled under your bed. You refuse to reach for it. You wake just after dawn, open the curtain, and check the sideboard. The tomato is still there, unmoved, unbothered, perhaps slightly riper. You decide it's time to see the garden for yourself. You dress slowly, linen shirt, waistcoat, gardening hat that implies both curiosity and caution. You step into your boots, one of which contains a small pebble, and your remaining sense of skepticism. The air is cool. Dew clings to every surface. You make your way past the roses, past the lavender, past the wall where moss has grown in the shape of something vaguely accusatory. And there they are, the tomatoes, planted in a tidy row, staked upright, their leaves still damp with morning. You hesitate before touching them. One leans toward you, the green globe at its center glistening as though it has just remembered something sinister. A mainstream historical fact. Despite their growing popularity on the European continent, many 18th and early 19th century English households still planted tomatoes with suspicion. Garden manuals sometimes refer to them with ambivalence, ornamental, though controversial, and included warnings about soil acidity and unpleasant humors. You pluck a single leaf, sniff it, sharp, green, faintly peppery, not evil necessarily, but not trustworthy. You pull out your notebook, make a sketch of the plant, label it tomato, probable threat. Underneath you write 4 blossoms, 2 fruit, no obvious signs of treachery. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some Victorian gardening circles, there were rumors that planting tomatoes near marigolds would cause the marigolds to wilt from sheer offense. This was never proven, but one pamphlet insisted the moral temperaments of certain plants should not be mixed. You return to the house, wash your hands twice, boil water for tea, stare at the tomato on the sideboard again. It looks slightly smug. You wonder how long it's been sitting there. You consider removing it, then decide to consult your apothecary first. He has stronger nerves and more vinegar. Your apothecary greets you the way he always does, like someone who has spent the morning grinding dried beetles and is only marginally surprised to see you. His shop smells of camphor, lavender, and faintly of caution. You step inside, remove your hat with deliberate dignity, and approach the counter like a man who is trying very hard not to sound unwell. "I need to discuss a tomato," you say. He pauses mid-pestle, looks up. "Ah," he replies, "a conversation I've had more than once this week." You exhale. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1800s, apothecaries in England and parts of Europe were fielding frequent questions about tomato toxicity. Although medical journals were beginning to publish evidence supporting their safety, the general public, particularly the Victorian gentlemen, remained deeply wary. No one wanted to be the first in their parish to perish by salad. You describe your symptoms. You have none. You describe your observations. He nods slowly, hands you a small jar of peppermint oil, and says, "In case it's psychosomatic." You ask if tomatoes are poisonous. He answers, "Not generally." You narrow your eyes. "Specifically?" He smiles. "Only when paired with cutlery made of questionable silver." Here's your quirky tidbit. One case, widely circulated in early Victorian circles, told of a gentleman who dined on tomato stew and promptly fell ill. The diagnosis? Lead poisoning from his plate. The cause? Acidity from the tomato reacting with unlined pewter. The lesson? Avoid stews, and possibly Tuesdays. You buy the peppermint oil, not because you need it, but because you trust tradition more than reassurance. You ask if he eats tomatoes. He replies, "Only when my wife isn't watching." You take this as confirmation of your suspicions. He adds a tin of caraway lozenges to your bag. "For nerves," he says. You thank him. Step outside. The air smells of rosemary and someone's dubious pastry. You walk slowly home, turning your collar up against the breeze, as if shielding your thoughts from further botanical scandal. Back at the house, the tomato has not moved, but it looks redder. You place the peppermint oil beside it, for balance, just in case. The tomato is now part of your decor. You've accepted this. It sits on the sideboard like a guest who hasn't been properly introduced, and yet no one dares ask it to leave. It's joined by a sprig of peppermint and a folded linen napkin, as though a tea service might break out spontaneously in its honor. You eat your supper, roast potato, boiled greens, bread that's either fresh or merely very good at pretending, and you do not look at the tomato. You almost succeed, until dessert. There's a tart, fruit-filled, glazed, and on top, in a flourish of questionable ambition, a single slice of tomato. You blink, stare, look around for witnesses. Your cook appears at the door, apron flour-streaked, expression neutral. "It's a foreign recipe," she says. You nod, slowly, like a man considering his last known will and testament. A mainstream historical fact. During the Victorian era, tomato recipes began creeping into culinary books, often disguised as exotic or Italian. Dishes like tomato aspic, tomato tarts, and spiced tomato preserves became fashionable in certain circles, usually among the very brave or the very confused. You take a bite, small, cautious. The tomato is sweet, surprisingly pleasant, faintly alarming. You chew slowly. Wait. You do not collapse. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some early tomato advocates encouraged their inclusion in desserts, arguing that with enough sugar and cloves anything could become fashionable. One 1850s hostess famously served tomato jam on scones and was subsequently whispered about in 3 counties. You finish the tart. Nothing bad happens. Except now you're thinking about tomatoes. More than usual. You return to the sideboard and stare at your original tomato. It remains dignified. You nod to it. Just once. Then sit down with your ledger and write. Tart. Unexpected. mildly unsettling. Possibly the beginning of peace. You underline it. Twice. Then open your newspaper. Avoid the editorial about the crimson fruit menace, and turn instead to the crossword. One clue reads, red fruit, feared, then loved. You smile. Leave it blank. On purpose. The morning light creeps into the drawing room with more confidence than usual, illuminating every surface with the kind of brightness that makes you question your housekeeping and your food choices. The tomato is still on the sideboard, now a day older, a shade deeper, and possibly smugger. You pick up your spoon, not to eat it, just to feel armed. Today, you decide, is a research day. You head to the library. A mainstream historical fact. Victorian gentlemen were known for sudden bouts of investigative enthusiasm, particularly when their digestion or personal pride was at stake. Tomato fears inspired pamphlets, newspaper essays, and even brief scholarly debates. Some readers embraced the idea of poison. Others dismissed it with botanical flair. You find the relevant section, botany, dietetics, and morally ambiguous vegetables. You flip open on the digestive disruptions of the southern fruit. The author's name is underlined. Twice. Probably by someone angry. You scan the first page. The tomato, bold and impertinent, offends both palate and gut. You raise an eyebrow. The next sentence is more generous. However, it may prove, with proper preparation, less offensive than initially feared. You scribble that quote in your notes. Circle the word may 3 times. Here's your quirky tidbit. One 19th century food theorist claimed tomatoes heated the blood and disturbed the moral compass, especially in warmer months. His work was widely read and immediately ignored by anyone with taste buds. You read until your tea goes cold. You make a chart of reactions. Raw, risky stewed, alarming jammed, fashionable pickled, acceptable if served with restraint. You pause only when the librarian brings over a plate of scones. Tomato-free. For now. Back home, you pen a brief letter to your cousin in Surrey. Have you consumed any tomatoes lately? If so, please, confirm your continued existence. Sincerely. You seal it with wax. Then stare once more at the tomato on the sideboard. It appears friendly. You consider moving it to the kitchen. You do not. Not yet. Instead, you place your notes beside it and whisper, "I'm watching you." It does not reply, but you're pretty sure it understands. You dream of tomatoes again. This time, they walk, slowly, politely, wearing top hats. One recites poetry, another juggles cloves. You wake before they serve tea, which is either a relief or a missed opportunity. The tomato is still on the sideboard. Of course it is. You approach it like a man approaching his own misjudgments. You touch it. It's cool, firm, a little softer than yesterday, as if ripening toward vindication. You decide it's time to cook it, or at least to attempt something that could be described as cooking if no one's watching too closely. A mainstream historical fact. By the late 1800s, tomato soup was beginning to appear in cookbooks across England. Often labeled Italian or exotic, it was frequently made with more cream than courage and served with a side of lingering doubt. You fetch a pot, dice the tomato, apologize softly, add butter, a little onion, a sprig of thyme for optimism. It simmers, gently, no screams, no explosions, just a smell, warm, slightly sweet, oddly familiar. You ladle a small bowl, sit, sip, pause, sip again. It is fine, maybe even comforting. You add a pinch of salt and immediately feel bold. Here's your quirky tidbit. One Victorian hostess noted in her journal that tomato soup is best consumed in private until one's constitution has decided whether to embrace or reject its temperament. You eat the rest. The room remains upright. Your pulse remains steady. You even feel a bit pleased. You rinse the bowl, set it in the sun to dry, then return to your journal and write, tomato, 1. Me, also 1. This is progress. The tomato on the sideboard has been replaced by its twin, a second, even riper specimen left there by the cook with no comment. You stare at it, then smile. Round 2. Soon. But not today. Today you sit with your spoon and your strange sense of peace, and let the soup do its quiet, victorious work. You spend the next morning in cautious reflection, not dramatic brooding, just a thoughtful hour in the garden, hands folded behind your back, wondering whether yesterday's tomato soup marked the end of an era or the beginning of a new culinary detente. The second tomato sits on the windowsill now, basking in gentle sunlight. You nod at it when you pass. It does not nod back. That's probably for the best. You decide to try something more daring. A salad. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-Victorian era, tomatoes were gradually making their way into English kitchens in their raw form. Still controversial, still whispered about in polite circles, but increasingly present in recipes involving vinegar, pepper, and the occasional apology. You select a tomato, wash it, slice it thinly, thinner than necessary, as though delicacy might protect your honor. You add cucumber, a sliver of onion, a drizzle of oil so timid it could pass for a footnote. You do not serve it to guests. You serve it to yourself. In the library, with the curtains drawn, you take a bite. Cool, slightly acidic. The cucumber pretends not to notice the drama. You chew slowly. Wait. Nothing happens, no headache, no rash, no whispered ghost of your great uncle suggesting that fruit should be baked or not at all. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some early advocates of raw tomato dishes insisted they should be consumed only at midday, and only when wearing linen. One pamphlet recommended pairing tomatoes with classical music and a firm handshake. You finish the plate, set down your fork, and feel a strange emotion. Confidence, possibly indigestion. You can't tell yet. You add a note to your diary. Tomato salad. Not fatal. Surprisingly pleasant. Try again. Possibly with basil. Possibly in public. You take a walk through the garden. The roses seem brighter. The basil nods approvingly. You tip your hat to the neighbor. She's harvesting tomatoes by the armful, and laughing. You think, maybe I'll plant one next spring, or 2, if they behave. You walk to the Apothecary again, not out of panic, but tradition. The tomato salad was uneventful in the best possible way, and now you're seeking confirmation, or possibly a certificate, of survival. He greets you with his usual mix of herbs and restrained amusement. You're still upright, he observes. I am, you reply. The tomato has not claimed me. He chuckles. Then perhaps it's time you try the tonic. You blink. The what now? A mainstream historical fact. As the tomato gained acceptance in the 19th century, some enterprising medical thinkers began promoting it as a digestive aid. Tomato-based tonics were advertised in small-town papers, particularly in America, for everything from anemia to general malaise. England followed, cautiously. He pulls a bottle from a high shelf. It is labeled Elixir Solanum, in calligraphy, with too much confidence. You raise an eyebrow. He pours a spoonful into a ceramic cup. You sniff it. It smells like celery with ambition. He insists it's for your internal clarity. You drink it. It's tangy, faintly sweet, vaguely like someone tried to ferment a tomato in polite company and got distracted. You feel fine, maybe even refreshed. You leave with a bottle under one arm, a tin of licorice powder for unrelated reasons, and a new opinion about tomato-based remedies. Here's your quirky tidbit. One 1870s health column recommended tomato juice as a morning pick-me-up, especially when the nerves have been jostled by too much socializing. Another advised it be served cold, with a dash of moral restraint. Back home, you set the bottle next to the sugar jar. It looks out of place. You give it a supportive pat. You sit by the fire and reread your diary entries. One from 2 weeks ago reads, "Avoid tomatoes. Dangerous. Red flags in fruit form." You laugh softly. You turn the page. Today's entry, tomato tonic. Surprisingly decent. No visions. No regrets. You add a postscript. Still watching the sideboard, though, just in case. You close the book and pour a second spoonful. For science, the tomato tonic remains on the shelf, nestled between the elderflower cordial and the emergency rhubarb bitters. It hasn't moved. It hasn't multiplied. You're starting to feel almost fond of it. You rise early and take it with your tea. One spoonful, just enough to taste, not enough to admit publicly. It goes down easier today. You pretend you don't notice. Later, you sit in the conservatory, reading the latest copy of the Naturalist's Gazette, which contains an article titled, "Tomatoes, Harmless, Useful, and Probably Not Agents of Disease." You underline probably. A mainstream historical fact. By the 1880s, tomatoes were steadily shedding their sinister reputation. Medical journals began publishing research linking tomato consumption to digestive aid, vitamin content, and mild anti-inflammatory effects. The public, still cautious, began requesting reassurance in recipe form. You flip to the opinion section, where a gentleman from Bath expresses concern that tomatoes are immodest in color and unsuited to the dinner table. You snort softly into your cup. Outside, your neighbor has planted an entire tomato patch. You walk past it slowly. The vines are lush. The fruit dangles. You tip your hat respectfully. She waves back, holding a basket of what must be 24 tomatoes and one very startled frog. You return to your kitchen, stare into the pantry. There, near the back, sits the cookbook your aunt sent you 3 years ago. Foreign dishes for the adventurous constitution. You open it. A tomato tart recipe stares back at you with quiet confidence. You begin gathering ingredients. Butter, flour, thyme, tomatoes. You hum as you slice. The crust crumbles just enough. The tomatoes glisten. You layer them, sprinkle herbs and drizzle oil. Into the oven it goes. Here's your quirky tidbit. The first printed English recipe for tomato tart included raisins, ginger, and a pastry crust, blending the line between savory and sweet in ways Victorian men were unprepared for. You set the timer, pace once, twice, then sit. You write, tart in oven. Sense of foreboding, low, smells promising. When the tart is done, you let it cool under the watchful eye of your cat. Then you slice it, eat, chew. Pause. Smile. You write one final note for the morning. This may be the beginning of understanding. The tart, it turns out, is not only edible, it's delightful, crisp, rich, herbaceous, and slightly smug. You eat a second slice, not because you're hungry, but because you want to prove to your past self that fear is no match for well-executed pastry. You wrap the rest and bring a slice to the apothecary. He takes one bite, blinks once, and says, "You've come far." You nod. You both sit quietly in his shop, chewing contemplatively, as if evaluating the geopolitical implications of tomato pastry. A mainstream historical fact. By the late Victorian period, tomato tarts, soups, and sauces had become mainstays in many British kitchens. Once thought suspect, the fruit had made its way into household cookbooks, restaurant menus, and even the occasional medicinal tonic bottle with remarkable grace. You leave the shop with a refill of your tomato elixir, Not because you need it, but because you enjoy the ritual. A spoonful in the morning now feels like a wink to your former skepticism. You pass the grocer on your way home. There's a crate of tomatoes outside displayed without shame. A sign reads, 3 for a penny, red as your courage. You chuckle. And buy 6. Here's your quirky tidbit. One London grocer in 1889 painted faces on tomatoes to make them more appealing to nervous buyers. The expressions varied: smiling, contemplative, faintly embarrassed. Sales doubled. The faces were eventually outlawed by a local ordinance for being too whimsical. Back home, you rinse your tomatoes, line them up on the sill. They glow in the afternoon light. You sit beside them with your journal. Write. Bought willingly. Consumed voluntarily. No fainting. Unprecedented. You sketch one. Add eyebrows. You walk through the garden later, nodding at your neighbor's expanding patch. She waves, holding a pie dish. You suspect a barter may be imminent. You return indoors, fill the kettle, and begin reading a novel that includes, without irony, a tomato salad served at a picnic. You mark the page, underline it, write in the margin, not fiction, just progress. You wake to rain, soft, measured, more of a conversation than a storm. The window pane blurs the garden into a watercolor of greens and grays. You pull your chair closer to the sill, a steaming cup of tea in one hand, and watch a single tomato on the vine bend under the weight of a raindrop, like it's bowing to the sky. You feel, somewhat absurdly, like bowing back. The sideboard tomato is gone, eaten, remembered, possibly transcended. Now it's just part of a quiet breakfast, a trace of flavor in yesterday's tart, a smear of memory on your favorite fork. You read a letter from your cousin. It begins, still alive. Had one with salt. Quite good. Apologize to my wife for previous outbursts. You laugh into your tea. A mainstream historical fact. Public opinion shifted slowly but steadily as culinary voices, botanical experts, and brave home cooks vouched for the tomato. By the end of the 19th century, the fruit had become a staple in both common and aristocratic kitchens. Even Queen Victoria's chefs included tomato dishes in state dinners. You walk to the pantry, select another tomato, and begin slicing with confidence. You sprinkle salt, pepper, a touch of vinegar, and set it beside your toast like you've done this forever. No ceremony, just breakfast. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 1893, a legal case in the United States ruled the tomato a vegetable for tariff purposes, despite its botanical classification as a fruit. The court's reasoning? People ate it like a vegetable. It was, quite literally, legislated into belonging. You butter your toast. Add the sliced tomato. Bite. Chew. You don't pause anymore. No waiting for symptoms. No scanning the room for family members collapsing in shared gastric panic. Just a well-dressed slice of truth. You jot a note in your margin journal. No ghosts yet. May offer to guests next week. We'll monitor reactions. You sip your tea again and watch the rain pat the tomato vines into a steady, sleepy rhythm. The afternoon hums softly, like a cat asleep on your windowsill. You sit in your favorite chair by the fireplace, flipping through a battered gardening almanac with marginal notes from 3 generations of people who spelled aubergine differently. You're not looking for anything in particular, just admiring the tomato section. So much red ink, so many exclamation marks. One entry reads, "Tried again. Still no funeral." You chuckle. It's been nearly a month since your first bite. The fear has faded, like a stain you forgot to scrub, a trace only visible in the right light and mood. Now, tomatoes are in your sandwiches, your stews. even a recent curry attempt that went surprisingly well, despite the nervous murmuring of your housekeeper. A mainstream historical fact. By the 1890s, cookbooks no longer prefaced tomato recipes with warnings. Instead, they featured entire chapters: tomato chutneys, relishes, sauces, and jellies. Tomato puddings were attempted and largely abandoned, but no longer considered criminal. You make a list for tomorrow's market: bread, goat cheese, tomatoes, possibly courage. You add a drawing of a tomato wearing a monocle for your own amusement. Here's your quirky tidbit. Victorian seed catalogs often describe tomatoes as robust, daring, and refreshingly red, using language that made them sound less like food and more like guests at an ambitious garden party. You stroll out to the garden before supper. The vines are taller now, leafy, comfortable, fruitful. A few bend under the weight of their own yield like tired philosophers. You pluck one, still warm from the sun. You hold it in your hand for a moment. Round, real, unafraid. You bite in. Juice runs down your chin. You let it. Because now, finally, it's just a tomato. No fear, no poetry, just food. Evening settles over your kitchen like a well-folded napkin. You slice a tomato with the precision of someone who no longer thinks it's out for blood. The knife glides easily. The seeds glisten. You arrange the slices on a plate with basil and soft cheese, then drizzle a line of olive oil that curves like a signature you're finally ready to write. The table is set for two. Your cousin has come to visit. She was once an outspoken member of the only cooked fruit should be trusted society. You pour the wine and raise an eyebrow. She lifts a slice, pauses, then takes a bite, chews, swallows, says, "Well, that's not terrible." You beam. A mainstream historical fact: social dining helped normalize tomatoes more than any publication. As dishes traveled from adventurous hosts to their hesitant guests, palates adapted, recipes evolved, and fears were softened by shared plates and repeated, unremarkable digestion. You pour more wine. Serve tomato tart. No one swoons. No one blames their headache on nightshade interference. You open the windows. Let in the night air. It smells faintly of thyme, rose, and the neighbor's tomato patch, which is now taller than the fence, and likely planning a memoir. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one London dinner party logbook from 1896, the host recorded the phrase, "tomato," passed with only 2 remarks, both in favor, which by Victorian standards was a glowing review. You clear the plates slowly, stack them with care, wrap the leftovers, write tomorrow's list. You think, maybe a soup for Sunday, a baked dish for the church picnic, a quiet tart for the next letter-writing day. You light a candle. Write in your diary, all is calm. The tomato sits on the shelf, waiting to be sliced, not feared. I may plant more. You underlined may. Then, a second time. Will, it's Sunday. Warm. Still. The kind of day that insists you move slowly, speak softly, and eat something seasonal. You're in the garden with a slice of tomato tart balanced on a ceramic plate, the crust flaking gently, the filling humming with quiet triumph. You sit beneath your sun umbrella, not for shade, for ceremony. A tomato deserves a proper setting, a mainstream historical fact. By the turn of the 20th century, tomatoes were fully integrated into English cuisine, no longer feared, but celebrated. Gardeners grew heirlooms. Housewives canned them in rows. Restaurants featured them proudly on menus beside roast beef and codfish. And no one wrote editorials accusing them of moral decay. You sip your tea. It tastes faintly of lemon and late bloom. You write a postcard to your cousin. It says simply, they're just fruit, but somehow that's everything. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Victorian gardening journals ran contests for the most well-tempered tomato. One winning entry in 1898 featured a fruit displayed next to a portrait of Queen Victoria with the caption, "May she reign, and this ripen without scandal." You finish your tart. Brush the crumbs from your lap. Look down at your fingers. Clean, warm, not trembling. You once feared this fruit. Now it's just lunch. You jot one last note in your diary. Peace is a plate of sliced tomatoes. No apology required. The breeze lifts a corner of your napkin. The cat naps near your ankles. And the neighbor waves from her window, holding a basket of what must be 10 tomatoes and a bottle of wine. You wave back. Think yes. Maybe next week. Maybe today. But for now, you sit quietly, belly full, pride intact, and forgive yourself completely for the decade of tomato paranoia. Wind down. And now, as the afternoon light slants through the window and the last seeds are pressed gently into warm earth, let your breath slow. The tomatoes have been sliced, the soup simmered, the tart served with a fork and a shrug. Let your shoulders rest now, like vines on trellises that no longer lean from worry. You've watched fear soften into curiosity. You've read the Latin names, blinked at pamphlets, and finally dipped a spoon into something red and real. Let the sideboard go quiet. Let the soup cool. Let the tomatoes sit in their bowl like fruit finally welcomed home. Breathe in, the scent of summer, the shape of ripening. Breathe out, the worry, the weight, the warnings written in fading ink. You are not at war with your salad. You have survived the sauce. So close your eyes. Let your thoughts settle like seeds in good soil, the kind that remembers everything and holds it kindly. The garden is quiet now. The fork is clean. The tart is gone. And the fear is past. You are safe. You are full. And tomorrow the tomatoes will still be here. Waiting. Patient. Just fruit. Now, dim the lights. And sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.